Silicon Valley has been exploding for days over Andrej Karpathy's podcast with Dwarkesh. I want to go into why it was so controversial, and now that the dust has settled, what the real takeaways are for builders, for people who want to work with AI in the here and now. So the first thing to do is to understand where Andrej is coming from. Andrej is one of the co-founders of OpenAI. He's someone who's been on the cutting edge of AI systems for a long time. He just released Nano Chat, which is a new tiny way to train your own GPT. It's great. But in that world where he is on the cutting edge, you have to understand everything he says from that frame of reference. And that's going to be something I come back to because it's quite a different frame of reference from being in the trenches as a practitioner or a builder using existing AI tools. What did Andrej say? So number one, the first thing he called out is that useful agents are a decade away. That was the title of the episode. And what he's saying essentially is that current agents lack memory, they lack robustness, and they lack reliability. He used the word slop, and people just jumped onto that in a way that I think even he didn't expect. And that is part of what drove all of this controversy. But in a way, like if you look at it, he's right. Agents don't inherently remember and learn. We have to teach them everything they know. Agents are not particularly robust. The most sophisticated multi-agent implementations I've been a part of tend to have robustness from architecture rather than robustness from agents themselves. And if you want reliability, again, you go back to architecture for reliability versus the agent itself. None of this, as a builder, this is me talking, prevents you having really high value use cases for agents today. And I tend to frame the work we have to do architecturally to make agents work as just the price that you pay for where agents are at. And the ROI is there because agents are able to do so much already. But the promise of agents has been much bigger than this. The promise of agents, which I think Andrej is reacting to, is that they will do anything, that they will be anywhere, that they will learn, they will be useful as they stand out of the box, that they will remember everything. And of course, if you've ever worked with an agent, you know that's not true. And Andrej is saying it's not true, and he's right. And so I think within Andrej's frame of reference, saying that really good agents that have memory, that are robust, that are super reliable, that don't need architecture in order to do complicated tasks, yeah, that does feel like it's a decade away, right? Like that's not necessarily right around the corner. The thing that I think from his perspective, he didn't feel the need to emphasize is that we can already get value out of them today. And I think that's the piece that I wish had come through a bit more in the podcast. There are companies saving on the order of hundreds of millions of dollars a year using AI agents today. Not next year, not the year after, not in a decade, today. Do those agents have struggles with memory, robustness, and reliability? Andrej is correct. You have to account for that in your architecture. A lot of what I teach people when I teach about agents is how you architect for the agents we have today. Doesn't mean they don't have value. And so the irony is, I can agree with Andrej that from his perspective, maybe agents are sloppy, but they can still add a tremendous amount of value as they are today. The second thing that he called out, the second big conversational theme, is that LLMs have cognitive deficits and that we have trouble driving effective pre-training dynamics with LLMs. This gets kind of into the weeds. For those of you who are not super technical, I want to make it as clear as I can. Fundamentally, pre-training is a really, really, really tough way to learn. All you get is a single signal, whether something is right or wrong. And so if you're training a model, all you get is this a yes or a no? Is this essay that I wrote good or bad? There is no room for any kind of nuanced feedback. It's a known issue. And that is part of why you have to have so many different kinds of responses from many different users during pre-training to get any kind of approximated learning. Andrej is right when he says that this model is really hard to work with. And you're sucking supervision bits through a straw. That's his words. I think he's correct. Like, it's a tough model to work with. I think the counterpoint to that is that as tough as it's been, it has delivered remarkable results. If we stopped LLM progress today, which there's not a sign of, we would still have more than a decade of technological progress in order to fully bake in everything that we already have. And so as much as I agree that LLMs don't learn like humans, and it is really tough to give them supervision through pre-training, and there are issues we're going to have to solve, none of that gets in the way from a builder's perspective at what we can do right now. The third thing he called out is that reinforcement learning is absolutely terrible, but he can't think of a better option right now. And I think he's calling for the industry on the cutting edge to think about this. This is what I'm trying to get at when I talk about this idea of credit assignment, right? Where you have a yes or a no. It's such a blunt instrument that it's really, 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 really hard to get it to work correctly. The conversation then moved over to economic growth. There's been a lot of assumptions about artificial general intelligence driving either, the doomsdayers say the end of the world, or a period of unprecedented economic growth, say the optimists. And one of the things that Andrej called out is that his base case, his assumption is that humans have been baking in a tremendous amount of innovation into our baseline 2% domestic product growth over the last several decades. And his current assessment is that AGI will blend in to the current trend of automation and will not see a shift in baseline. So he's not saying it's the end of the world. He's not a doomster, but he's also not saying there's going to be a step function in growth. That also got a lot of controversy. But I see where he's coming from. I think one of the things that we've struggled with as a discipline is we still have no answer for the fact that our lives changed profoundly in the 90s with the advent of the internet and the personal computer. And that never, ever really showed up in the gross domestic product growth data. Similarly, the mobile phone and the invention of the whole social web never showed up in GDP data. And I think that what Andrej's challenging us with, and I think this is useful, is he's challenging us not to expect miracles. Don't expect doom, but also don't necessarily expect that everything will suddenly be solved. This is in stark counterpoint to some of the more dramatic predictions that have come from particularly the team at Anthropic lately, who have been on the record saying that they expect very dramatic shifts in employment, in coding, etc. Andrej is just not seeing that. He's seeing this as part of the ongoing story of technological innovation, and that we are writing the next chapter with artificial intelligence over this decade, and that even though it may feel like a profound shift to us, it may not show up in those economic statistics as plus 8% GDP growth, right? From a builder's perspective, the takeaway I have is that we should not expect miracles when we are trying to plan our systems. I think we do much better planning our systems when we just have a gradualist case and it's super basic, and we can just move on with building the system and not worrying about whether or not we're building toward nirvana or doom. It's much more useful to just try and build something today out of the systems we have. And we'll get gradually better systems over time, which is something Andrej affirms. One of the things he talks about a fair bit, it's sort of a lengthy diversion, is a conversation about self-driving. And you wonder, why is this coming up? Well, self-driving is an example of how difficult it is to teach AI a real-world skill. And I've been thinking about this for a while. It was fun to hear Andrej's take. Essentially, self-driving has almost infinite edge cases. That is why when Waymo comes to a new city, it cannot just put the cars on the road. It has to learn the entire city because every corner is unique. And so what Andrej is saying is that getting to self-driving is still a rocky road because we have to learn these lessons about edge cases, data, safety, how we transfer all of that to agents. And he wants to make sure that we understand that even though we've had flashy demos on self-driving, in most cities around the world, there are 0 self-driving cars, even though you can go to parts of San Francisco and get them today. And he's calling out the gap there is around those same things he emphasized at the sort of top of the chat, right? Around memory, robustness, and reliability. You cannot generalize a Waymo driving agent to any city. You have to custom train it. And that is brittle and that is tough. And he's right to call that out as an issue. At the same time, as a builder, Waymo is not stopping rollout, right? Waymo has like a half a dozen or 10 cities they're trying to roll out to right now. Driving continues to get solved over time. And we are doing something really similar on the AI side, where we're just biting off pieces of the problem and going after it. And that's an area where I think Andrej and I agree. Given the pace of the kinds of problems we're solving and how quickly we're solving them, if you want a world where you have a truly generally intelligent agent that can do absolutely anything with robustness and reliability, and it doesn't need architecture to support, train, give it structure and scaffolding, it might take 10 years. He might be right about that. The last thing that he talked about that I want to call out is a conversational theme around education. He talked about the idea that personalization and AI tutors are super promising for helping people to learn what they need to, with the caveat that we have some challenges around memory that we need to address. And this is something I've called out for a while on this podcast that I do. Memory is not an easy problem to solve. Memory is a tough problem. Memory with AI, doing it well, is not easy. I broke down why on a video not too long ago. If you want to teach people usefully, one of the things you need to do is to be extremely good at incrementing the next lesson in a way that is useful based on the agent's memory of the student's interaction with the material. It's a complicated task, and you have to make sure that you are ready to give the agent that responsibility. And I think one of the things that I'm really curious to see, I know there's a number of initiatives going on right now around education and AI. I want to get into the weeds. I want to understand better how education and AI are solving issues of memory when it comes to learning from students, and how we're able to do that in a way that is responsible, respectful, privacy first, but also learns from the student. It's a real challenge. And I think Andrej was right to call it out, but it's also a real opportunity, and he recognized that as well. Let's jump to the reactions. The reactions were almost uniformly terrible. The headlines picked up the most sensationalist take, like agents are slop, AGI is a decade away, and they framed it as popping the bubble of AI in Silicon Valley, or as rebuttal of near-term artificial general intelligence optimism. And I think in many ways they took Andrej's words out of context. In fact, he sort of suggested that when he wrote his follow-up post on X later. He did not intend to ignite the kind of firestorm that he ignited. And I don't think he realized how much his words are taken seriously, not just by people inside Silicon Valley, but by the world at large, because of his stature as a founder of OpenAI, or a former founder of OpenAI. I agree. I think the reaction is way overdone. I think that there is almost no reason for the kind of hostility that I saw in the press toward the Silicon Valley AI community, unless there's that sort of underlying hostility toward AI that this piece tapped into. And it's kind of ironic, right? Because Andrej is someone who helped to build the AI we have today. He's certainly not anti-AI at all. And yet I felt some of that hostility coming back in, or getting tapped into, in the reaction I saw from the press. So what's a better way to respond to this? You understand what he's talked about. I've given you a few hints as to my take, but let's ladder this back. I want to give you 4 under-noticed points that people aren't talking about from Andrej's piece, and just dig into it a little bit and talk a little bit about my takeaways. Number 1, there is something rich in what Andrej was talking about around continuity over rupture. So the idea is, think of continuity in your business planning as a heuristic. Assume steady compounding. Assume steady compounding of capabilities. Assume steady compounding of growth. Assume steady compounding and not magical step changes. Assume that the boring reliability work you do today is going to be relevant. I think that one of the things we're really missing is a return to anchoring on a steady sense of the future, because AI has felt so uncertain. And one of the things I'm grateful for that I wish people would talk about more is that Andrej sees a steady sense of the future. Andrej is not panicking. Andrej is actually seeing the problem of agents as a really hard one that's going to take a long time to think through and solve properly if we solve it in its totality, which is the way he framed it. I'm looking at it as a builder and saying, for this tiny piece of the world where we already have agents, wow, we have a lot we have to do architecturally to build well. But the good news is, Andrej is saying you've got runway to do that, right? You can build well now. Continuity over rupture. That is a discipline you can practice. That is not living in denial. And I do think I've heard people say, if you believe that things will just be the same, then you're living in denial. Absolutely. There's going to be massive changes associated with AI, but we will see a continuity in those changes. We can see those trends. As an example, is it true that jobs are evolving because of AI? And is it true that we can trace those patterns and project out trends? Also true. There's a kind of continuity in the trend line that we can understand. You can see literally on the graph the line going up for AI job postings. Yes, that's continuity too, because you can see that a new industry is forming, and the new industry has new jobs. We have seen that before. We saw that with every major technological innovation through history, with steam, with rail, with silicon and computers. You see new jobs forming. Same with AI. It's actually not that different. The other thing that I think is not well talked about is that his reinforcement learning critique is not anti-reinforcement learning. For those who are deep in the weeds, there was a lot of reaction that suggested Andrej doesn't believe in reinforcement learning anymore. No. And he clarified this, but like the straw metaphor that he used is a specific indictment of the kinds of sparse trajectory level signals that bleed across all tokens in earlier versions of reinforcement learning. If you have richer, finer grained supervision and you have better memory, you can start to get to higher quality reinforcement learning. And if that's over your head, that's fine, but you can take it away as he's critiquing the lack of signal that you get when you take these blunt yes or no instruments and just apply it to the whole model, which is what I talked about earlier. But he's saying you can use the same principle of reinforcement learning with finer grained supervision, really high quality data, and improved memory, and you're going to get much better results. And so he's essentially calling for us to get better at reinforcement learning and think about how we do it in a richer way, which I think is a good challenge. Not something I have to deal with, thankfully, but for those in the model maker community, it's relevant. The third point that I think is undercovered is that human learning and LLM training is not just a data scale problem. So we've talked about in the past this idea that if you train LLMs enough, maybe they're going to get to the point where they can match human learning. What he challenged is this is not just a data scale problem, right? Andrej's point is that without durable memory, agents will not approximate human learning trajectories. Your agent cannot learn the way you learn if it cannot remember like you remember. He came back to the memory problem. Now, the press associated this with slop and really was negative, but I think the more interesting point here is that the memory problem is something that Andrej sees at the root of a lot of other issues. And if we can solve for LLM remembering in a reliable way, we're going to correspondingly unlock a lot of extra power. So much of what I do when I am advising clients and working with folks on building agent systems is we think about memory for the agent. What memory is needed for this agentic task? Where does it live? How does it update? Who touches it? What are the permissions involved? How does it change over time? We are dealing with memory engineering. And what Andrej is saying is that that is a hard thing to do now. He's right. And if we're going to make it easier, we are going to have to solve some root problems with LLMs that remain unsolved today. And I think that's a fair point. The fourth thing that I think didn't get talked about enough is the evolution analogy that he used. At one point, he talks about the idea with Dwarkesh that DNA is a kind of miraculous compression, that we can compress our entire existence as humans into this tiny little DNA strand. And yet somehow we come out and we start to learn as babies and we grow, and it becomes this tremendous compression algorithm, right? Where DNA is incredibly able to build useful learning creatures. And I think that one of the things he called out here that didn't get talked about, that certainly got buried in all of the slop conversation, is he said, and this is not something that everyone agrees with in Silicon Valley, by the way, but he said very clearly, we should not use that analogy, that is a description of what humans are, maybe a description of what animals are, but not a useful description of LLMs, even by metaphor. In other words, it's not just that LLMs don't have DNA, it's that we should not try and mimic that pathway because we are trying to build useful and controllable tools. We are not trying to build animals or creatures. There may be some people who disagree with him there, but I think that is a really good point, and I think it's worth making again. We are trying to build useful, controllable tools, and the metaphors that we are using for most of this end up not being tool metaphors. And we could use that because we are trying to optimize for the wrong thing if we're saying we're building people, because we're not building people. So is this the decade of agents? I would say it is. And I think that my answer is optimistic, where in the same wording, the press has picked that up as pessimistic. We have so much in front of us to build from an agentic perspective. We are just getting started. One of the things that I did as soon as I saw this is I went back, and I'm going to include this in my write-up, I went back and looked at how I've written about AI agents in the past, and I want to pick out some of the principles of AI agents that stand the test of time, that are in line with what Andrej is talking about here. And I want to give you a write-up prompt that helps you to wrestle with the implications of AI agents in your current software stack against some of the principles that Andrej is talking about here. So is my agent assuming reliability? Right? Is my agent assuming continuity? Is my agent dealing with memory appropriately? I think those are really interesting questions. We don't talk about them enough. And I felt like this podcast was a doorway for me to think about them. So if you want to think about them too, you can dig in. I did a whole write-up on it. Enjoy. Don't panic, as always. And we'll wait until the next Silicon Valley post catches on fire. Cheers.